Hey everybody, this is the next episode of Tim and Fran versus the Man. I'm Tim.
My friend.
So, we just wanted to let you know to stay inside, live in fear, don't get any sunlight, wear three masks at all times. I'm in my bunker, and I haven't left the house. And it's a good thing for you also to do as you're told and to obey the government and all of its mandates. And, people who are protesting and all this stuff, they should be shot on sight. That is a good way to deal with those people.
Yes. I'm, when I'm not socially distancing, I'm hanging out over here in the bread line because, our government, it forced us to stay inside, but had no actual plan to economically, support or keep the economy going. So I'll be here in the bread line for the remainder of the episode with my mask on, of course. It might be hard to stay 6 feet away from people, though, because, there's a lot of unemployed people right now.
Yeah, but it is a sacrifice that we have to make because a virus that has, or the best estimates that have around a 0.2 or 0.3% death rate, it's definitely worth having mass amounts of unemployment and starvation. This is a good idea.
Yes, and also, it's definitely worth suppressing information from the public that's been known since December and January, and then slowly releasing it via the media to create a continued culture of fear. Overall, it's a great response, and so I'm going to be keeping these on. Gotta stay safe out there.
Surprise, just kidding. All that stuff sucks.
Oh, didn't see it coming, probably, I bet. So I wanted to talk today about how this all began, from my perspective, because I was one of the first people that I know of who, wow, my face just completely blended in with the background. I was one of the first people that I know of that pretty much was tracking COVID. And at the time it was called a mysterious pneumonia in Wuhan, China. And I kind of want to talk about the initial suppression of information related to this virus. And then basically sort of the change from suppression and underplaying this disease to now overplaying it and slowly releasing information that's been known for a while. And so basically when this all started sometime late November, early December, the Chinese government arrested pretty much anyone who would talk about this virus or use the naughty word, I'm talking about SARS here, to describe this virus and what it was like. And the only way this information was essentially brought to my attention was the site that I occasionally look at, flutrackers.com. And it's a non-government, sort of non-corporate forum for doctors and journalists to discuss medical findings from around the world, especially emerging infectious diseases. And this site, since mid to late December, was sort of leaking reports from the front lines in China, doctors treating COVID patients, and they were able to breach through the censorship. These guys aren't sort of like the people who now are talking about COVID, where the people now who talk about COVID are more statists. These people more freedom of information, almost like, I don't know, in a way like badass, like libertarian doctors who will go around the censorship of whatever government they may be reporting from. But if you were paying attention at all in December and January, you would have known that this virus, A, highly transmissible, spreads to the air, occasionally affects children really severely. And, this was known for the longest time, and doctors that reported on it, weren't really surprised. But what happened was, at the same time these scientific papers were coming out, the media downplayed the virus. And there was sort of this weird cultural movement to downplay it. And what I think happened was it allowed the virus to sort of reach a critical crisis level or whatever. And it's almost as if the state willingly allowed it to spread while suppressing information. And then when it reached a critical point, the media went into fear mode, scaremongering mode, and that sent people into their panics, their respective panics. Essentially what I'm saying is, as severe as the virus can be, all of the information you're hearing about, it affects the heart or it may affect children, that's all been known, and that information's been suppressed. And I think really slowly to continue this fear, this anxiety, and this uncertainty among the population. And I'm just here to tell, I'm basically here, basically saying that, this virus is manageable. This virus you can protect yourself from this and any virus that breaks out, and especially as libertarians and anarchists, self-reliance is kind of our MO. And so we don't need basically these overarching destructive policies that are keeping us locked away and keeping us in a state of fear. Instead, just being proactive and just not panicking. I could put links in this video description wherever it's posted to some of these papers, and so people can keep themselves informed if they want, and how to properly address, minimizing exposure. Another side of things, I forgot what I was going to say. So that's kind of my initial spiel, some of my initial thoughts. I'm not saying obviously panic. I'm just saying use your own brain when adjusting to this threat. This isn't the Black Plague. This isn't smallpox. This isn't Ebola. And also there was initial concerns that pretty much anyone could spread it very easily. And now it's being shown that this virus depends primarily on super spreader events. And what that is basically one person spreads the virus to multiple people, instead of going over to your house, Tim, and I spread it and then you spread it to another person. It'd be more like one of us gets it, we hang out in an enclosed office for a while, and we're the only one that's really able to spread it to other people. And there was a study out of Israel that showed that 80% of the infections could be traced back to just about 20% of the population, small groups and individuals they shed the virus way more. So it really calls into question, in my mind, some of the official protocols that we're currently seeing in the country. And then it also, it makes me wonder why we had such a medieval response to this in the first place.
Yeah, I think going off on a lot of that, I think that you're completely right that the media response went from basically completely underselling it, completely ignoring it, to the other extreme of basically saying that it was doomsday, rush to your bunkers, all these sort of kind of absurd, over exaggerations about it. And what's really interesting is if you look at a lot of the people in the, alternative media, a lot of the people that the mainstream media has been attempting to sideline and call oh, they're far right, they're bad people, don't listen to them. A lot of these people were actually reporting on this disease and a lot more responsibly the entire time, especially Styx Hexenhammer, 666. He's probably one of the best people who is reporting on this, who is reporting on the coronavirus. And he's been reporting on it since January 7th, which is way before most of the mainstream media outlets were even talking about it, or if they were talking about it, they're like, oh, it's a complete nothing burger.
Right.
And because I was watching his material throughout basically the entirety of the coronavirus. And, he was giving people advice like, yeah, stock up on the essentials. There might be some panic. And he was basically like, the whole message the whole time was like, yeah, don't panic. Just, get some extra supplies. Just stay home for a couple weeks, or if you have the ability to, all these kind of common sense sort of suggestions. And a lot of the other people in the alt media were doing similar stuff to that. And they were reporting on it a lot earlier than the mainstream media was. If you looked at the mainstream media and a lot of the political class, like well into February, they were still acting as if this thing was, a complete nothing burger. Like there was absolutely nothing going on. But what was it? Like Nancy Pelosi was encouraging people to go to Chinatown and like hug people or something like that.
Yeah. I do remember that. And actually there's a tweet, and I would need to look pretty hard to find it, but essentially the Surgeon General in like January saying like nothing to worry about. You're more likely to be struck by lightning or something, getting it. Like masks aren't a thing, like you shouldn't even be thinking about wearing them. And then, within the next month, he literally released a video on how to make a mask out of a t-shirt. And ironically, the shirt had like a got naloxone, like instead of like a got milk. And so it was a weird sort of like drug war, like, I don't know what kind of message they're trying to send, but clearly, this is at the very least, a really great example as to why the state is just inept. Yeah. Or
especially the globalist state. I actually wrote down some like dates and stuff because I was having a debate with a friend. Mm-hmm. Let me see if I can find some of this stuff.
Right. And to continue to kind of talk about, how I started the video with the lack of action early on and perhaps intentional lack of action. It took the World Health Organization, which, on an almost monthly basis, like declares public health emergencies, over like weird tropical diseases or like, these exotic types of illnesses that'll probably never become global pandemics. Mm-hmm. They were so reluctant on this, especially Dr. Tedros. They dragged their feet. And, it was very clear coming out of China, if you knew where to look, there were videos of people like passing out in the street, videos of like overwhelmed hospitals. And this whole time they were telling us like, no, it doesn't spread easily person to person. It's nothing to worry about. And again, my whole point here is not to like harp on like the panic mode. It's just to look back at where our leaders and basically the whole system just like fucked it, like just completely failed. Like we have this whole like public health surveillance system from individual doctors, and some of the doctors in this even were arrested. Some of them died from coronavirus itself as they were speaking the truth or trying to speak out about it. And at the time, the media and sort of international public health establishment, whatever you want to call it, was ignoring them. And it wasn't really until like, it affected Italy and Iran that finally they wanted to drum up the fear tactics.
And
that stupid basketball game, I'll never forget it. Like, I think it was like the Spurs, or like it was just so, it took that basically being closed down because one of the players had coronavirus for everyone to be like, ooh, sports turn off. What? Like,
yeah, I found it. The WHO, they didn't declare COVID-19 a pandemic until March 11th. That's crazy. You have to really put that into context. The entire alt media was warning people about this thing since January. Most of them, and even the ones who weren't warning people about it in January, they were warning about you They were warning you about it in February. The WHO did not take action. This is the organization that's supposed to protect us from, that's literally their entire job. They're a global organization designed to protect us and our health needs. They didn't consider it a pandemic until March 11th.
Wow.
Well past the point. When the alternative media and the supposed kooky conspiracy theorists were warning people about this. So, I mean, I don't know. I think or when people come up with these very strange ideas like that, oh, well, this is clearly like, freedom's clearly failed and like all this weird stuff. It's like, maybe check your numbers again, buddy. Maybe check that math again. It kind of looks like your globalist, like your global government organization screwed the pooch the hardest, harder than any, I don't know, this is probably one of the biggest fuck ups in history, honestly.
You could ask, let's see, just ask we just crossed 100,000 in the US, but, there's about 349,714 people you could have asked if this was a fuck off, but they're deceased now because. But anyway, I do remember as well, like some of the WHO meetings, because I have a weird like fascination with just like disasters, infectious diseases, all kinds of stuff. So I really like December and January. My doomer self was like, "Fuck yeah, this is coming on. This is going to be big," and. Right. I thought it was going to be almost like a plague-like event, or at least like a 2003 SARS-like event, and like really, compete with the state for, I guess, really give the people like an opportunity to, I don't know, change their communities, in sort of the power of the state to be challenged for once, and even some like world leaders got infected with it, like Boris Johnson. And it basically, it became apparent to me that for whatever reason, the major, medical establishments were ignoring the chance to communicate the risk properly. Because if they communicated this, when like you and I were looking at this, or like Styx was looking at this, it would have been like 2003 SARS. It probably would have stayed in China, maybe gone to like the West Coast, Philippines, a few sort of not remote, but, there could have been a few clusters. And instead they waited and waited and, put out this sense of calm complacency. And then we're like, guess what, guys, a virus never before seen. It's in probably your community. And, in a way it was brilliant to essentially get the max amount of fear out of the population, and so really the early part of this, I'm always going to be pissed off because like A, people have died, and B, like here we are in, I don't even know, week 10 of lockdown. There's still no solutions. There's still like, I'm still pretty much out of a job. And now people are more afraid now than they were back in December, which is completely opposite. If you're trying to communicate like a risk of something, you want people to become less afraid as you communicate more. Instead, again, they've waited, and so you have the opposite. You have the complacency, and then the curve of fear increasing. That's really the curve you need to like be flattening right now if you want to get back to normal. But clearly, they don't want us to get back to normal. And God, the amount of times I've heard like this is the new normal from the MSM and people I talk to. It's like
that's sort of and it's kind of interesting because it almost seems like it's like a new propagandistic buzz term that came out of nowhere. And whenever that situation occurs, I mean, I don't want to sound all tinfoil hat or anything, but the problem is if that sort of like linguistic propaganda starts coming out of absolutely nowhere, but suddenly all the mainstream media outlets and the political class and like corporate leaders are saying this sort of stuff. It's, it's very unlikely that that's legitimately organic.
Right.
Very unlikely.
And, this is kind of a good segue into legislation that's come as a result of COVID. You were just talking to me about HR 66666? 6666, I don't know.
Yeah, that's the big one. That's probably the most disturbing piece of legislation. So I'm actually going to refer over to my official research person, Mike over here, and I'm going to have him look up exactly what the legislation says. Hi, kids. I'm interrupting this podcast for a second to actually read out the word for word what the bill says, rather than the summary I did for the main podcast. So the first thing you're going to want to notice about HR 6666 is that a lot of things are written in a sort of vague manner, and most likely intentionally so. And when things are written in a vague manner, it usually means that there's some treachery afoot, because that means it can be interpreted in any way possible by whatever parties are doing the interpreting. So the problem is that when that occurs, it's very easy for them to interpret it in a way that is actually harmful or not conducive to fixing the problem, but potentially abusing powers. So let's get into this. So it says, Section 2, COVID-19 testing and contact tracing using mobile health units. In general, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, acting through the Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, may award grants to eligible entities to conduct diagnostic testing for COVID-19, to trace and monitor the contacts of infected individuals. Now that's probably the most disturbing line right there, because it doesn't really talk about whether that's a choice or not, but let's continue. And to support the quarantine of such contacts through mobile health units, and, as necessary, testing individuals and providing individuals with services related to testing and quarantine at their residences. So, what this all sounds like is that they're essentially allocating funds to certain organizations that are going to monitor and track people and then make certain that they stay in their house. And that's sort of the interpretation I'm getting. But of course, it's written in such a way where it doesn't really tell you if this is it doesn't really tell you if it's voluntary or mandatory or not, does it? That's interesting. Permissible use of funds. A grant recipient under this section may use the grant funds in support of the activities described in subsection A: to hire, train, compensate, and pay the expenses of individuals, and 2, to purchase personal protective equipment and other supplies. So that's basically just saying it's giving these organizations the funds to either compensate, I'm assuming, the individuals that are in quarantine, or it's also probably talking about as well the people actually hired to make certain people are in quarantine and monitor other people through contact tracing. So the problem is whether or not that this is very Orwellian really comes down to interpretation. But the problem is that if you write something this vague and with that it could be interpreted like this by me, then that's extremely dangerous, because you're leaving that interpretation open to the people who are going to be implementing this bill as well. But basically, the gist, well, the most disturbing part of the legislation, basically it gives money to local organizations to combat COVID-19 or whatever. But then there's this one little part in the legislation that basically gives them the money and license to hire people to monitor others in order to
contact tracing.
Yeah, so basically they're giving people license to contact trace other people. And what's interesting is in a lot of other countries, they're doing this through like an app or something like that, and it's all like, voluntary or whatever. Although I find this Orwellian enough, because clearly they're not respecting your privacy, but in a way at least they are allowing you to opt in or not. They're allowing you to opt in or out of downloading this app. But the legislation appears to suggest that you don't really have an option, because there are actually people hired to spy on other people and report if people have COVID-19. And I mean, I think that's really beyond the pale, because if you look throughout the history of totalitarian societies, one of the largest indicators of when you're approaching that sort of society is the public's willingness to rat out their neighbors, their fellow countrymen. And that's why it disturbs me so much, because this is literally paying people to, for the greater good, in order to reduce the amount of COVID-19 cases, to basically rat out, spy on and rat out their neighbors in case they technically have the virus.
And it's funny too. Contact tracing generally is most effective. Again, like if they did contact tracing when back in like December, January, like again, as you mentioned, the alt media was reporting on it, it would have been wildly successful. But now we're in the part of the epidemic where we've passed the exponential point. We're starting to kind of level off. Like contact tracing at this point, like there's just so many people infected that like it's a futile effort. It's a fool's errand, and it's just not going to work. And obviously, of course, the intention here is not just contact tracing the general public welfare. There's power to be gained here.
Yeah.
Especially so.
And I think I agree with a lot of the people I've been listening to. This is basically the new 9/11 in the sense of it's this large galvanizing event that is sort of, it's allowing people who have been lying in wait for a very long time, that have wanted to implement more controls on the population. it's giving them the perfect excuse to do that, because I don't really buy. I don't tend to buy this idea that it's just completely organic, and because people go into fear mode, that they would necessarily think of all these things like automatically. I think that a lot of the time they're actually malicious interests who are sort of lying in wait in order to do this, to exploit that fear response. I'm not saying that the fear response isn't real. Like, obviously humans, as soon as there's a large crisis, they tend to go into this, the kind of blinders go up, their vision narrows, and they start going into like pure fear mode. But it seems to me that a lot of the time you almost have these like greasy people, in positions of power, who are basically waiting for something like this to happen so that they can abuse it to its full potential.
As you're saying that, I kind of thought of another parallel to like 9/11. And like years before 9/11 even happened, there was, increasing intelligence, increasing reports that eventually there'd be a terrorist attack in the U.S. somewhere. Eventually that our, really shitty Middle Eastern foreign policy would cause some kind of blowback. The CIA said it, security analysts said it, and they were ignored and dismissed, And then when it did happen, well, oh my God, there's a terrorist around every corner. Oh my God, we need to take your Fourth Amendment rights. And that's exactly what's happened with COVID. Oh, it's far off. Oh, it's not even that bad. Oh God, it's horrible. And it's in your backyard. You can't even see like your mother on Mother's Day.
Right.
That like schizophrenic hive mentality, that whiplash. It almost even like stumped me for a second. I was like, oh man, we gotta get ready. And then I started slowing down and going like, if you give people the actual data, the actual information, you talk about the virus for what it really is, and then you encourage them to sort of figure it out on their own and see how it fits in with their own life, it's a lot less scary. And, there's someone who's like communicated, because I forecast the weather, I'm a meteorologist, I don't use a thunderstorm coming or I don't lie about a thunderstorm coming, and then as it's coming in, I don't use it to control people. The whole time you have to communicate the risks, like this thunderstorm could produce hail, strong winds, whatever, heavy rain. You don't do a fake out. And honestly, I'm just very disgusted by both intentional and unintentional suppression of information that went on early. And so, you're just going to keep hearing from the media these quote new developments, or like the virus is mutated to affect kids. And there were studies in Wuhan released late January showing that there's a small number of kids that get the Kawasaki syndrome, where their blood vessels swell. That's not uncommon with these types of viruses, coronaviruses, especially some that may cause more common colds. They can also cause it. It's rare, it's super rare, but this is going to be the call to, keep the schools closed. I mean, I agree with keeping the schools closed indefinitely, but that's a whole different thing.
The government-run ones,
yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. I just think it's kind of hilarious too. Like, what is the College Board doing right now? They're probably shitting their pants. Something like this.
Oh man. Yeah, those guys are fucked. I don't feel bad for them at all, though.
No.
The other thing though is all the legislation they're attempting to sneak under people's radar while fear mode is on, that doesn't even really have anything to do with COVID-19. I think it's the first stimulus bill. But with the first stimulus bill, they attempted to give you a government crypto wallet. So they were basically attempting to create a new government digital currency.
Oh.
And what that's basically setting people up for is the replacement of the dollar with a much more easily traceable, trackable digital currency.
And inflatable.
Yeah, and the funniest part about it was that it was going to be backed up by the United States dollar, which I just laughed out loud at. Like that was so funny to me. But yeah, these guys were just trying to, pull a fast one on everybody, because they're basically saying, oh, well, cash is dirty. It's going to give you the virus. So we're going to give you this electronic currency so that we don't actually have to come in contact with you. But obviously, I mean, just like you have to check your premises, like what is to be gained with that? How does that change the way that we use currency? How is that, like, how can that be manipulated? Because once you understand how it can be manipulated, it's going to be manipulated that way.
And like realistically too, like what's the percentage of infections that's going to reduce? Is it, are we finding that 50% of infections are coming from, people rolling up dollar bills and snorting coke off of people, like, or like exchanging dollar bills? I don't know, being dramatic here, but like if it's a 2% reduction, like what, why would you systematically change your entire system of currency to prevent a 2% or negligible increase in infections? So I've not heard of dollar bills being a main source of transmission. I've heard airborne, but of course they said it wasn't a thing back in like February.
Yeah, I mean, I think they actually came out and said recently that it can't be, or it is difficult for it to be transmissible through surfaces. So, I mean, I'm no expert, but I think technically a dollar counts as a surface, even though it's a very thin, it can't really hold anything up or whatever, but it is technically would qualify as a surface.
I don't think it's like very planar. I don't think it gets any more surfacey than that. But again, it seems like even now they're starting to, either they're learning more about it or they're again trying to create this sort of culture of confusion. So there was a recent study done in New York City where they calculated the mortality chance, basically 0.26 rather percent. And I'm reading up on it, and this is due to there's three studies. There was the people who were actually infected, they tested positive and had the symptoms. There were the people they tested antibodies, and then there was, and then so that's excuse me, that is that data set with the cases. In terms of deaths, they used confirmed deaths, suspected deaths, and then excess mortality, like sort of compared to normal deaths on any given year. And so basically with all of this, they found that about 19.9% of the population of New York City has had COVID antibodies for some reason or another. And they also found, with the total population being 8,398,000, they found that the actual deaths are probably closer to 23,000. And so what you have is the 13,000 confirmed, 5,000 probable, where they just can't like keep up with the bodies coming in. And then 5,000 on top of that, like excess deaths compared to normal. That gets you right around 23,000. And so what you do is you calculate the infection fatality rate. You get the 23,000 divided by 1.7 million people who are exposed. Gets you a 1.4%. But then if you divide that 23,000 by the total population of New York City, this gets you your probability of dying to date. So right now you have a 0.28% chance if you're in like New York City of dying to date, or at this point. That will change obviously as more people get infected, and it may go up, may go down. But I think I'm worried that they're doing the same thing again, where they're underplaying it, and then there's going to be, well, look, they're going to ease the lockdowns, they're going to underplay it, and then the infections and deaths may spike up again and be like, well, look, we should have never reopened. We could never live like this again. And they're going to use it again as like a secondary false flag, not false flag, but you know what I mean? You sort of set the pieces up to fall in the perfect way.
Yeah, that's something that was something I'm mildly worried about too.
It also should be the case that like there's just not even this virus isn't really much of a threat to that. That's also like a distinct possibility. I'm just saying as we see more people get infected and dying, that like crude mortality rate, they call it, will probably go up slightly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just like an average. You take an entire population and you look at the risk of them dying from it. And so there's a couple of problems going on here. First of all, our country, with its public education system, mathematics is definitely not
very strong. Yeah.
Very strong. And that's intentional. Obviously, you don't want a mathematically illiterate population because then they could see through bullshit and understand that, $20+ trillion in debt is not sustainable. And, government's rapid check. Oh. What? And so basically what I was saying was they're using a bunch of different variables and not explaining them to people.
Right.
People have differing ideas about the true fatality rate of the virus. And so you're creating a culture of just continued confusion and continued fear because, in the absence of information, a human being's mind is probably going to go towards the worst case scenario or a worst case scenario or a scenario that's slightly worse than what's actually reality. And so with that, they're kind of keeping this, it's the same as like a fog of war.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely seems like they're attempting to keep people as confused and as afraid as possible.
Right.
I mean, and I think that this clearly relates to they want to attempt to pass as much sort of legislation while people are distracted by this virus as possible. And the other really disturbing bit of legislation that they've passed, besides the other two that I've mentioned, probably the biggest one, or one of the biggest ones, is that they just allowed government agencies to look through your search history, like your internet search history, without a warrant. And then, of course, like Snopes and all these fact checkers are saying, oh, well, that's mostly false because it's only for counterterrorism measures, you see. So what I said to that was, it's a good thing they're not calling protesters of the lockdowns terrorists or anything.
Right.
Or else, that might give the government the go-ahead to look through their search history. So it's really good that no one's doing that.
So basically, all of our followers should Google search ricin anthrax AR-15 Liberator model and just completely throw it off. That's ridiculous. So did they even try to justify it with COVID related anything? Did they just blatantly pass it through thinking no one would notice?
I think, if I recall, it's actually like a layover from the Patriot Act, but they just re-signed it. They said, we're going to keep this legislation. If I remember correctly, I believe that that's the case. But, if people were but of course, they would pick now to be the time to continue that legislation while everyone's distracted with COVID-19.
Well, I wouldn't worry too much because we're not considered terrorists, right?
I mean, not yet.
No, but I know Trump has had multiple opportunities to repeal the Patriot Act because it's voted for in the budget every year, and so far has not decided to.
But Francis, I thought that Donald Trump was a hero attempting to destroy the New World Order. Wasn't that the pitch?
I never got that. I never quite fell for that, and there's a lot of anarchist YouTubers that I look up to who completely were sold on that.
Yeah, I must have missed that memo as well, because I never hopped on that bandwagon. I think that I may have. Well, I didn't ever hop on the bandwagon. I think I was like, for a week, I was like, well, maybe he might be better than Hillary.
Right.
But I'm not even honestly sure if that's true. I think it might have slowed down the progress of the totalitarians for like a little, but not by any serious metric.
Right. And what is the cost of that been now? So essentially you have a left that's foaming at the mouth. You have anyone who's considered, or you have the libertarian, anyone who's libertarian minded is now lumped into someone who likes Trump and is that kind of mindset, sort of a nationalist and racist, which I obviously don't agree with. And that's what they've done with their movement. That was the risk they took with Trump. It was either he was going to destroy this global order so effectively that this type of conversation, whether or not libertarians are racist and stuff like that, that would just completely be over. And instead, people have a scapegoat now. They have a figurehead.
Oh, yeah.
What's wrong with libertarians when Trump's not even a fucking libertarian?
Yeah, and you're kind of seeing that with the COVID-19 lockdown protesters.
Right.
They have been painting them. I said this in the video a couple weeks back. They're painting them as like these dumb rednecks who are racist and white and privileged and all this, the typical stupid like buzzwords that the left uses to discredit anything they don't agree with. This is actually something I do want to get into. It might not seem that important, but I think it's a lot more important than you might expect. They're now calling these people are attempting to open back up the economy Karens.
Yeah.
And what's so bizarre about that is that, a Karen is supposed to be the bossy, like, basically the bossy, like, cunt mom who yells at the manager and basically tells everyone else what to do, while I guess at the same time thinking the rules don't apply to her. But the problem, what about the Karen personality really correlates with being an anti-vaxxer or being like a conspiracy theorist or being against the lockdowns?
Right.
Like, honestly, Karens are the type of people who would be completely pro-lockdown, completely pro-authoritarianism, completely pro-contact tracing, or at least for everyone else that's not them. Right. They'd probably be a little annoyed when it affects them, but they would want those sorts of policies for everyone else.
Yeah, I jokingly was talking to a friend and I was like, who's more of a Karen? People asking for the lockdown or people asking to take it away. And they make that completely answers that question. Yeah, people on anarchists, people who are out protesting currently, they're kind of the anti-Karen. They're, I've never seen Karen at a state capitol with an AR, assault rifle. They would not do that. They would be the ones calling the police on those people.
Yeah, exactly. So you kind of see this new form of linguistic propaganda that the left is using to basically paint their enemies as the sort of like privileged white people or whatever.
It's
But
just
really,
funny too.
a lot of these people are people who are, losing their businesses. They're having to collect unemployment for the first time in their lives. A lot of these people are being totally fucked over by these measures, and they're attempting to place them in this class of like privileged Karens, and they're using this linguistic propaganda to completely change what a Karen actually means. And I almost get the sense that this is I don't know if that's actually completely organic. I almost feel like I'm not I'm not sure if the left is actually smart enough to come up with that on their own. So I'm not entirely sure how organic completely changing, completely altering the original definition of Karen, actually is. I think it might be coming from some more malicious sources who kind of like fed it into the mainstream.
It's actually hilarious that you mention all of this because, a lot of the criticisms of the lockdown protesters is that it's not organic grassroots movement. It's, quote, astroturfing.
Yeah.
You think back to when the last time, a lot of people in the rural and, suburban middle class were kind of rising up, and that was the Occupy Wall Street movement. Right. There was no mention of like astroturfing or any of that, false terms, despite the fact that, I don't know if you remember, but Obama pretty much directly endorsed the protests, said like these are good, hardworking Americans. And, I'm not saying, I think everyone obviously should be able to protest and vent. I think
of course.
Regardless of that, I may not agree at all, but it's not up to me to decide. But there was I don't remember any of that criticism of like his administration saying like, he explicitly said like straight up, like, this is America's voice right now. This is what everyone's feeling, where I hear a lot of people saying like, oh, Trump's encouraging these protests and he's encouraging violence and this and that. And I don't think he's really explicitly said, go out and protest. I don't think he's explicitly like said, like, I support you guys. He may, his tone is kind of like, let's reopen. He's anxious to reopen, but
he may have had a few passing comments about it. I don't honestly remember entirely because I'm not a Trump fanboy. I don't.
Right.
I'm not leaning on his every word. And it's like, oh, what's Trump gonna say next? I can't wait for the next Donald Trump speech.
Yeah, and I'm simply comparing this to the last time we saw people in the working class, because primarily that's what the people in the streets today, the primarily working class.
Mm-hmm.
The last time we saw it happen was Occupy Wall Street in like New York and around the country, around the world, honestly.
Right.
And that was never claimed to be like astroturfed or artificial, or it's just really funny. And now you have like a genuinely organic movement where both the state and the current economic model we have is like failing people. This is like, you'd think this is like a golden opportunity for the left to be like, yes, like let's gather the ranks, let's all get in the streets. And instead, I don't know if they're pussified or scared or.
Honestly, I think that I hate to say it because I know the problem is a lot of the times when I speak like this, I'm probably going to be accused of like some tinfoil hattery or something like this. But honestly, I think that the smarter, more intelligent, but more malicious characters on the left, and I mean the people who are probably organizing Antifa, the people who are organizing the movements, and not necessarily George Soros or whatever. And maybe, who knows, George Soros might be like in on it in some way. I'm not sure.
Right.
But what I'm basically saying is, I think some of the more intelligent people in the movement are hoping that the economy fails so that we have to implement leftism because they're going to say, well, this is capitalism's fault. Even though obviously, and of course, anyone with a half-functioning brain can tell that the state literally shutting down all businesses is not capitalism, but the left is still going to blame capitalism, and they know they can probably get enough people to blame capitalism if the economy completely shuts down, even though it was clearly government intervention that caused the problem. So I think that some of the more malicious people on the left have essentially realized their best strategy was to attempt to further the lockdowns so that the economy crashes, so they can implement more leftism, and make that part of the new normal.
See, it's really funny because, as libertarians, we'll see this is an agenda, that the left for a very long time, not just like the new left and, over the last few years, that has wanted to do. But libertarians, people who follow like Stefan Molyneux and race theory and all that shit, they'll be like, oh, it's just an attack against Trump. And it's like, no, regardless of who's in power, the left, this has been their goal to smash capitalism, to destroy it. And
right.
This is a golden opportunity for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually don't think that they'll be successful, which I find extremely amusing. And the reason why I don't think they'll be successful is because the Democrats are keeping their economies shut down, the Democratic governors. And I think that those people do realize basically that if the economy crashes, they can probably blame Trump. But what they're not really counting on, or what they're not thinking in their head, is that Trump's just going to come back and he's just going to be like, look, the Democratic governors, this is their fault. They're a bunch of losers. They crashed the economy. They're totally, totally stupid people. Everyone hates them. And believe me, they're not great. They're totally, totally terrible. And he's going to do that to them, and it's going to be really fucking funny. And they're actually going to get blamed. And I think that this actually might be one of the first times you're going to see a massive economic crash where there's the current party is actually reelected during an economic crash, which is going to be a really interesting thing to see.
Yeah. Let's see. I think I've said most of what I wanted to say, because we've been talking about this stuff for a while now, and I wanted to give that perspective, and I'm not trying to be when I talk about the severity of the disease and all, I'm not trying to be a pussy, or I'm not trying to have people obviously stay in their homes. It's just, the state is not a good, science that's mediated through the state is just not good. It's going to continuously be changed as the state's agenda changes and communicated in different ways, and there's going to be subtle propaganda associated with it. What I'm saying is look at the sources. A lot of good free medical journals out there. Look at what the doctors who are treating the patients are saying, and not the ones who are on TikTok and getting paid to count COVID patients.
Right.
The people who literally are in bumfuck Indonesia and have nothing to gain from this. The people who have, listen to their recommendations, and just practice common sense. This virus isn't a mystery. It's not something out of a science fiction novel. We've dealt with coronaviruses before. They have weaknesses. We know them, even though our governments right now are pretending like we're still learning about this, and it's still very rapidly evolving. And, because unlike a flu virus, you think about viruses as pieces of genetic information, each bit is like a sentence. And so flu viruses, for example, they have multiple pages, if you will, of genetic code. And every year those pages, you may swap pages, you may swap the entire order of them, and that fucks up human immunity. With coronaviruses, imagine the same amount of genetic information, but on a single page. And so instead of these crazy mutations and completely change the characteristics of the virus, you have maybe sentences that change, or periods are moved around or whatever, and that, keeping that metaphor. And so we'll probably see the media over the next few months continue to say this is a new development. Just don't listen to that crap. Just go to the science. and just read the reports that have been publicly available for months, that, you know, and read it without the influence of the media, I guess, which shouldn't be too hard for like most followers.
Yeah. That's part of what's really bothered me about this whole thing, is that a lot of people who are quote unquote, you know, they're scientific and they're calling other people like science deniers, is that they are basically listening to the mainstream media, and as far as the mainstream media is caught up with what we understand about the science, and anyone who takes the actual data and then extrapolates an opinion and actually critically thinks about the data itself, they're called like a science denier, and that is literally anti-scientific. You're supposed to actually, well, you're supposed to, like, you know, science is obviously always changing, new data is always coming in, you're supposed to keep up, you know, up to date with the data, and you're supposed to actually, you know, think about the data, and you're also supposed to think about, you know, past experiences, like, you know, how is, like, other viruses that are similar to the coronavirus family, how did they interact with the world? You know, we know how diseases tend to operate. How has that operated in the past? But it's almost like a lot of people have just been kind of, you know, reading data off a spreadsheet. Well, not even. They've been allowing the media to read it for them off a spreadsheet.
Right.
And then they've basically said, oh, yep, that's the official science. And it's like,
BuzzFeed presents the official science. Because these motherfuckers have been, through years of Facebook-related social engineering, their attention span's been whittled down to like a gnat. And
silver lining, Huffington Post and Vice are actually tanking right now because of the COVID-19. So if there's a silver lining to all this, get fucked, Huffington Post and Vice. Oh man, that is a really nice silver lining.
I heard The Atlantic as well.
Oh really? That's wow.
Let's get Vox now. We need to get Vox, and we need to get. You said BuzzFeed is going down the shitter?
It might be. I think it was. I think it's Huffington Post, but actually, I think I need to.
Huffington Post. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure.
But yeah, that's awesome.
This just is like another major victory for alternative media, and you know, whether it's the people who were blowing the whistle on the virus initially, or now the people who are communicating common sense guidance.
Right.
You know, alternative media is the way to go. Like, honestly, I first learned about all of this just watching videos from Wuhan, and I'm like, you know.
Yeah,
and then also it's so strange because, well, not strange, it's very predictable, but big tech platforms were censoring those videos. They were censoring the hashtag, because this trended for a while, the hashtag CCP virus, the Chinese Communist Party.
Oh, of course they were doing.
And like so like in a way, they literally they contributed to the isolation and arrest and killings of whistleblowers. And so, you know, fuck you, Mark Zuckerberg, and
Jack Dorsey and all these people. You know, I guess the one last thing I guess I would want to mention about all this would be I think not enough people are talking about Keynesian economics and its horrible effects on this whole crisis. Because literally Keynesian economics and the fact that we keep on inflating the currency literally encourages people not to save money.
Right.
So none of these businesses can actually afford to shut down, and none of the people have a rainy day fund, and our government, you know, I don't want to rely on the government, but let's say all of a sudden I'm a minarchist now, and I'm like, okay, fine, I guess we have a government, and I guess maybe it can bail out people this one time or whatever because it's a extenuating circumstance.
Sure.
Well, they literally don't have the money to do that because of John Maynard Keynes and his theories. Because we're $25 trillion in debt now, and beforehand we were, $23 trillion in debt, and we're going to be many more $1 trillion in debt. We're passing a second stimulus bill, which is going to cost us like $3 trillion. This is so ridiculously unsustainable. And if we hadn't adopted the Keynesian economic model, businesses would actually be able to afford to shut down. People would actually have a rainy day fund if they got laid off from their work. The government actually would have money to potentially help people. Not that I think that that's actually the best solution. As far as I'm concerned, the government needs to go away completely. It should smash the state as far as I'm concerned. But, the Keynesian economic model has made everything so much worse.
Right. And, they're depending on, it's just so funny how they distributed the money too. They gave people a lump sum, $1,200. And obviously what's your first instinct? I bet most people are like, oh, I'm going to treat myself, or, alcohol or weed or whatever,
Yeah.
So these Keynesian thinkers are depending on basically chronically substance-dependent people with $1,200 to re-stimulate the economy. And it's just absolutely absurd.
I also loved how, for the most part, they just bailed out billionaires and people who really didn't need that money. And then, I'm seeing a lot of these left-wingers complain on Facebook or whatever. And they're basically saying like, oh, well, the problem is that the government is mismanaging resources. The problem isn't that they shut down the economy. And I'm like, what do you think governments do? All they do is mismanage resources, you dumb fuck. That's sort of the failings of the thought pattern of, left-wing people, is that they have this strange notion that if they just get their guy in, they're not going to be bailing out billionaires, and they're not going to be spending on wasteful projects and all this stuff. Look, what would happen if Bernie Sanders got elected? You want to know what would happen? He would bail out the billionaires, and he would bail out everyone else, and everyone would get on unemployment, and we'd be $30 trillion in debt.
Right. And no one else is talking about how this has been the largest consolidation of wealth ever.
Yeah. This is a massive transfer of wealth from the middle and working class to the rich elites.
Yep.
All in the name of fighting the coronavirus. And of course, they're using the coronavirus as an excuse, not only to do that, but take away people's rights to spy on us, to, pass through all of this, sneaky legislation. And, there's nothing good about it.
Sorry, I had to sneeze, which is ironic. Maybe I have it.
Well,
yeah, I think I pretty much, I said what I needed to say. This pandemic's, once again, all it's done is shown me what or at least I've already known, and that the state is completely inept. And that even though we had so many layers and there was so much promise, oh yeah, if a pandemic ever came, we'd defeat it. It would never get to this point. It's funny. A part of me just smiles and laughs because we're completely powerless against this thing, especially if we depend on a centralized state for the solutions.
Yeah, I think that the government is essentially failed at every level. And even the governments who had a supposedly good response, like people are talking about Hong Kong, Thailand, and then like communist Vietnam who had a good response. Well, you know, what they're not really mentioning is that they're basically needing to completely get rid of people's privacy rights in order to do that. And you're kind of coming to this unfortunate decision, because right now what you're seeing is, now that Vietnam has reopened their economy, their coronavirus cases keep slowly going up. So it's not really stopping the virus. It was at like 200, I think, in April, but now it's like 327. So you're not really stopping the spread of the virus. You're slowing it down through contact tracing. But the problem is that it doesn't seem like contact tracing is actually killing off the virus. So if you're not killing off the virus, you're either going to have to indefinitely contact trace, which means getting rid of people's privacy rights forever, or you're going to have to, when you get rid of contact tracing, just let it burn through the population again. But actually, I mean, even if they do contact trace indefinitely, it's just going to like really slowly burn through the population.
Right.
So it doesn't even, I mean, their solutions really don't make any sense.
Right. I mean, a lot of obviously like short-term promises. And again, as I said before, contact tracing is most effective when an outbreak is just starting. Not, I mean, we're almost in like the retrospective phase. Like, oh wow, that was a bad outbreak.
Yeah.
You know, contact tracing now. Like, no, obviously, who's in charge of this stuff?
I mean, contact tracing is really only effective during the beginning. But honestly, I would argue or at least it seems to me in the long run, I don't even think it's going to work, because once you stop contact tracing, it seems to me that it's just going to burn through the population unless they contact trace indefinitely, and then there goes your privacy rights. So is that really worth it? I would say personally, no. I would rather just deal with the disease rather than, you know, completely just say, oh, fuck the Fourth Amendment. I mean, of course, Vietnam doesn't have a Fourth Amendment. I also just, you know, part of me isn't even sure about Vietnam's numbers because it is a communist like dictatorship.
Right.
So, I mean, technically a lot of people are saying that, oh, we can confirm their numbers because of this, that, or the other thing. But I don't know. It seems a little bit fishy because North Korea is saying they have 0 cases. It's like, all right. Yeah. Okay.
Did they just kill him? Like,
yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Either that or they're just completely lying, or both. They're probably doing both.
Right. Man, I was about to say something. I completely forgot. Shit. I'm just looking at like different countries' curves now and just comparing. Like, I don't know. It's quite funny. You know, Canada hasn't really flattened its curve either. Like, there's been a whole lot of critique of the U.S. quote not flattening the curve.
Well, what's funny is that a lot of the states that have already opened, they're doing a lot better than a lot of the states who are still closed.
Right.
Like New York and New Jersey are some of the biggest. They have like the biggest number of deaths and the biggest number of cases, and they're still closed. So the tactics clearly aren't working for them. So
when the issue with this virus too is like a lot of studies showed that the most transmission occurred in households. You know, that it wasn't necessarily just like you go to Burger King and you touch the counter and you touch your face and you have it. It was, you know, you're taking care of grandma or whatever and she coughs on you and, you know, for prolonged exposure. And so the effect of a lockdown, keeping people in these close exposure situations. And so it's time to modify, it's time to move past. And, you know, and in New Hampshire, for example, where I am, there's been a movement to, instead of like fully reopening, doing things outdoors. so having a normal life, but, eating outside, for example, or like having haircuts with like windows open and good ventilation, stuff like that. So, where the state has had this sort of heavy-handed, bumbled approach, there's a lot of pragmatic solutions out there that we can implement in our communities and, our places of work and where we go and eat. They just aren't being discussed. Again, it comes down to that level of fear, because everyone sees the nightmare situation where every hospital is overwhelmed and, Timmy with his appendicitis can't get treated and all of that. Not too close to home with the name there. I was just thinking of the name. And so, yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say. And also, I'm not like an anarcho-primitivist, like fully, but, it's a fallacy that we think as like our modern society, we can stop any disease, or like we're immune from the natural process of, nature occasionally thinning the herd out with viruses and bacteria and things like that. And, so you have a lot of people operating in this mindset that we have to beat it. We're going to beat it. It's almost going to be easy. It's going to only be like, you only need like an app for contact tracing and stuff like that. When in reality, like, we're still very much a part of the natural system. And viruses can and will affect us. And no matter what we throw at them, Mother Nature and things like that will always prove to outwit us. And I guess really that's what I mean.
Yeah, I guess I would just close off with, you can just look at every level. The government has been either incompetent or, almost like purposely bumbling of this issue. They've failed every step of the way. And now they're using it as an excuse to take our rights away and to pass stupid legislation through while no one's paying attention.
Right.
So I think that instead of people looking to this as an example of the government being completely necessary in times of crisis, I think that this only goes to prove how completely useless and harmful they are during a crisis. And I don't know, I really do think that this is going to be seen as the next 9/11, and all the people calling for these types of controls are going to be ridiculed and mocked in 10 years.
Right.
So I guess with that, remember, kids, viva la revolution.
But indoors and behind a mask, of course.
Of course.
Yeah, I'm actually going to be heading back out to the unemployment line, so I will talk to you later.
All right. Later, buddy. I'm going to go back into hiding.
Good.
I'm going to lock myself in my basement.
Good.
So, all right. I'll talk to you later, man.
All right, man. Yeah, tell me about the next TikTok you see from the emergency room doctors.
Of course. Yeah, I always keep up to date with TikTok and the various Chinese spyware.
All right.
So,
Peace.